The hymn rose through Rowans Chapel like smoke from a funeral pyre, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. 23 voices blended in perfect harmony, singing Rock of Ages, with such devotion that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. It was Sunday morning, August 11, 1839, in Cypress Hollow, Mississippi, and the air inside the whitewashed chapel hung thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms placed on the windowsills. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden pews where 112 souls sat in their finest clothes, heads bowed in prayer, completely unaware they had less than 3 minutes to live. The enslaved choir stood elevated in the loft at the back of the sanctuary, arranged in 3 neat rows as they had been every Sunday for years. Their robes were simple but clean, dark fabric that concealed the weight of what each person carried beneath. William Mercer, the choir director, stood at the center of the front row, his deep baritone anchoring the melody. His hands moved in gentle conducting motions, guiding the tempo, while his eyes remained fixed on the backs of the white heads below. Those same hands had practiced this moment 1,000 times in the darkness of slave quarters, in the secrecy of swamp meetings, measuring the weight of the pistol hidden against his ribs, calculating the seconds between the final note and the first shot. In the congregation, plantation owner Marcus Thornfield sat in the front pew, his substantial frame settled comfortably as he listened to his own property sing praises to God. His wife Catherine sat beside him, their 3 children arranged like stair steps to her left. 2 rows back, the Ashmont family occupied their usual spot, 7 members strong. The Wickhams filled an entire pew. The Belcourts. The Whitakers. The Grays. 7 plantation dynasties and their extended families, the architects of Cypress Hollow's cotton empire, gathered as they did every Sunday to worship the God they claimed blessed their prosperity. A child fidgeted in the 3rd row, swinging his legs against the pew until his mother placed a firm hand on his knee. An elderly man's head nodded forward in the warmth, jerking back up as he fought against sleep. A baby cooed softly in its mother's arms. These were the mundane movements of a peaceful Sunday service, the kind that had played out in this chapel every week for 17 years without incident. But Sophie Whitmore, standing in the 2nd row of the choir, knew every face below. She knew which men visited the slave quarters after dark. She knew which women turned away when children were torn from their mothers' arms at auction. She knew the price of every human being in this room, because she had heard these people discuss it, calculate it, justify it with scripture and smiles. Her fingers rested against the fabric of her robe, feeling the outline of the knife strapped to her thigh. Her voice never wavered on the hymn. Beside her, Temperance Gray sang with her eyes closed, but she was not lost in worship. She was counting. Counting the seconds. Counting the heartbeats. Counting the cost of 6 months of planning, of whispered meetings, of terror swallowed down like bitter medicine every single day. Her 2 children were buried in unmarked graves on Wickham Heights plantation, worked to death before they turned 12. The woman who owned them sat 4 rows back, fanning herself delicately against the August heat. The hymn moved into its final verse. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. The irony was not lost on the choir. They had hidden themselves well. They had been invisible, obedient, and trusted. They had smiled and bowed and sung beautifully every Sunday while plotting the most coordinated act of resistance Mississippi had ever seen. Adam Kane, at 41 the eldest of the conspirators, felt the scars on his back pull tight beneath his robe as he drew breath for the final notes. 200 lashes. That's what the plantation ledger had recorded. That's what his back remembered. The man who ordered it sat directly below, head tilted back slightly as he listened to the music his property created. The final note hung in the air, pure and sustained, before fading into silence. The congregation remained still, heads bowed, savoring the moment of reverence. Reverend Obadiah Thornton stood at the pulpit, preparing to deliver the benediction, his hands raised. William's hand moved. Not to conduct, but to signal. In one synchronized motion, 23 enslaved people reached beneath their robes. The silence shattered. The first gunshot was so loud in the enclosed space that several people in the congregation thought lightning had struck the building. The second shot followed before they could process the first. Then a third. A fourth. Screams erupted as Marcus Thornfield slumped forward, blood spreading across his white shirt like a blooming rose. Catherine Thornfield turned in her pew, her mouth open in a scream that never fully formed before Sophie Whitmore's bullet found her chest. Chaos consumed Rowans Chapel. People scrambled over pews, pushed children beneath seats, ran for the doors only to find them barred from the inside. The choir descended from the loft with weapons drawn, moving with grim determination through the aisles. This was not frenzied rage. This was methodical. This was justice administered by those who had been denied it for lifetimes. The children's screams were the worst. High-pitched and terrified, they filled every corner of the chapel as the massacre unfolded. But the choir did not stop. Could not stop. This moment had been 6 months in the planning, but centuries in the making. If this story has shaken you, you're not alone. This is one of the most suppressed chapters in American history, deliberately buried because it challenged the narrative that enslaved people accepted their bondage passively. Before we go deeper into how this happened and why, I need you to hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the historical stories that textbooks won't tell you, the macabre truths hidden in our past. And drop a comment below, what's your initial reaction to learning about the Rowans Chapel slayings? Do you think acts of violent resistance like this were justified given the brutality of enslavement? I want to hear your thoughts, because this is a conversation we need to have. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about what Cypress Hollow was, and why 23 people decided that Sunday morning would be the day everything changed. To understand what happened inside Rowans Chapel on that August morning, you have to understand what Cypress Hollow was. This wasn't just another southern county. This was a kingdom built on blood and cotton, a place where wealth flowed like the Mississippi River itself, and that wealth came from one source alone: the systematic brutalization of human beings who had been stolen from their homelands and forced into bondage. Cypress Hollow sat in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, where the soil was so rich it was almost black, where cotton grew thick and tall, where fortunes were made in a single season if you had enough hands to work the fields. And in 1839, the 7 major plantations that dominated this county had plenty of hands. Thornfield Plantation alone claimed ownership of 147 human beings. Ashmont had 132. Belcourt, 119. Wickham Heights, 106. Rosewood, 98. Greystone, 87. Magnolia Bend, 79. Combined, these 7 estates enslaved over 800 people, each one catalogued in ledgers like livestock, each one assigned a monetary value that reduced their humanity to dollars and cents. The plantation owners didn't just coexist in Cypress Hollow. They formed an aristocracy, an interlocking web of business partnerships, marriages, and shared interests that created a unified front of power. Marcus Thornfield, the patriarch of the wealthiest family, had married his daughter to Jonathan Ashmont's eldest son 5 years prior, cementing an alliance between the 2 largest estates. The Wickham and Belcourt families had been business partners for 3 generations, splitting the profits from a cotton gin they operated jointly. These weren't isolated plantations operating independently. This was a coordinated system of oppression, refined and perfected over decades. And Rowans Chapel was the crown jewel of that system. Built in 1822 by the plantation owners themselves, using the labor of the people they enslaved, the chapel served as far more than a place of worship. It was a boardroom. A courthouse. A social club. Every Sunday, after the service ended and the enslaved choir was dismissed back to their quarters, the white families would remain. They would discuss business deals over cold lemonade. They would arrange marriages between their children. They would set prices for cotton sales, coordinate their shipping schedules to the New Orleans markets, and most importantly, they would discuss the management of their human property. The chapel's ledger, which survived the massacre and remains archived in the Mississippi State Historical Society, shows the kinds of conversations that took place within those walls. In March of 1837, the plantation owners voted unanimously to increase the daily cotton-picking quota from 150 pounds per person to 200 pounds. Anyone who failed to meet the quota would receive 10 lashes for every 10 pounds they fell short. In July of 1838, they agreed to a collective policy: any enslaved person caught learning to read would have their right hand cut off as an example to others. In December of that same year, they discussed the breeding program they had implemented, forcing certain enslaved men and women together to produce children who would increase their property values. These were not occasional cruelties. This was systematic, calculated oppression carried out by people who convinced themselves it was not just economically necessary but morally righteous. The sermons preached from Rowans Chapel's pulpit reinforced this worldview Sunday after Sunday. Reverend Obadiah Thornton, who had held the position since 1830, regularly quoted scripture to justify slavery. He preached about the curse of Ham. He reminded the enslaved members of the choir that the Bible commanded servants to obey their masters. He told the white congregation that their wealth was a blessing from God, proof of their righteousness and moral superiority. But what was life actually like for the 800 human beings who created this wealth? The historical records, particularly the testimonies collected by abolitionists who visited the region in the 1850s, paint a picture of hell on earth. The average enslaved person in Cypress Hollow was awakened before dawn, usually around 4 in the morning during picking season. They worked until they could no longer see the cotton in the darkness, often 10 or 11 at night. That's 17 to 19 hours of backbreaking labor. They were given 2 meals a day, a breakfast of cornmeal mush and whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots, and a dinner of the same, occasionally supplemented with salt pork so rancid that even the plantation owners' dogs wouldn't eat it. The living conditions were deliberately designed to be barely survivable. Slave quarters on these plantations were wooden shacks, typically measuring 12 feet by 12 feet, housing anywhere from 6 to 10 people regardless of family relationship. There were no floors, just packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained. There was no heat except what could be generated from a small fireplace that also served as the cooking area. Families were crammed together in spaces that would be considered inhumane for animals, let alone human beings. And the violence. God, the violence. The plantation owners of Cypress Hollow had perfected cruelty into an art form. Whipping was so common it was barely remarked upon in the plantation journals. 20 lashes for talking back. 50 lashes for working too slowly. 100 lashes for attempting to run away. The overseers, men hired specifically for their willingness to inflict pain, carried whips made from cowhide, designed to tear flesh with every strike. Some enslaved people bore scars that covered their entire backs, layer upon layer of destroyed tissue that never properly healed because they were back in the fields the next day, wounds exposed to dirt and insects and infection. But physical violence was only one tool of control. The plantation owners understood that breaking the spirit was just as important as breaking the body. Family separation was used as the ultimate punishment and the ultimate threat. A mother who refused to work could have her children sold away. A man who showed defiance could watch his wife auctioned off to a plantation in another state, never to be seen again. The historical records from Cypress Hollow show that between 1835 and 1839 alone, over 200 people were sold away from the 7 plantations, deliberately torn from their families as either punishment or profit. Sexual violence was endemic and systematic. Enslaved women had no protection from the men who claimed to own them. The plantation owners and their sons treated enslaved women as property to be used however they wished. Sophie Whitmore, who would later stand in that choir loft with a knife strapped to her thigh, had been repeatedly raped by Jonathan Ashmont since she was 14 years old. She had given birth to 3 children by him, children he refused to acknowledge as his own but still claimed ownership over. When her eldest daughter turned 13, Ashmont began visiting her quarters as well. This wasn't an isolated case. This was the norm. The mixed-race children born on these plantations were walking evidence of the sexual terrorism that enslaved women endured, and yet the system treated this as acceptable, even economically beneficial since it increased the enslaver's property. The plantation owners justified all of this through a carefully constructed ideology that combined economics, religion, and pseudoscience. They genuinely believed, or convinced themselves to believe, that black people were inferior, that slavery was the natural order, that they were actually doing their enslaved workers a favor by Christianizing them and keeping them fed and sheltered. This delusion was reinforced every Sunday at Rowans Chapel, where they gathered to worship a God they claimed blessed their enterprise. And here's the most insidious part: the enslaved people were forced to participate in their own oppression. They were required to attend church services. Required to sing in the choir. Required to smile and bow and express gratitude for the mercy of their masters. The psychological torture of this cannot be overstated. Imagine being forced to stand in that choir loft, singing hymns about God's love and mercy, while looking down at the people who raped your daughters, sold your sons, whipped your husband until his back was hamburger meat, and then went home to count the money they made from your labor. The chapel itself was a physical manifestation of this power structure. The white congregation sat in comfortable pews on the main floor, cushioned seats with their family names carved into the wooden ends. The enslaved choir stood in the loft at the back, elevated but separated, visible but voiceless beyond their assigned songs. They were there to provide ambience, to make the white family's worship experience more pleasant with beautiful music. They were living instruments, human props in a performance of piety that masked monstrous cruelty. But the plantation owners made a critical miscalculation. They believed their own propaganda. They convinced themselves that the people they enslaved had accepted their bondage, that the smiles were genuine, that the obedience was real. They never considered that behind those forced smiles, behind that beautiful singing, something else was brewing. Rage. Desperation. And eventually, a plan. The 7 plantations of Cypress Hollow operated with brutal efficiency because the enslaved population was kept deliberately fractured. People from different estates rarely interacted. Overseers ensured that any gathering of enslaved people, even for religious purposes, was monitored and controlled. The plantation owners knew that unity was dangerous, that if the people they oppressed ever organized, ever coordinated, their entire system could collapse. After all, the enslaved population outnumbered the white population in Cypress Hollow by more than 3 to 1. The owners' power existed only because it was maintained through constant vigilance, constant terror, constant division. But they had created one exception to this rule, one space where enslaved people from all 7 plantations came together regularly, unsupervised, united in purpose. The chapel choir. Every Thursday evening, the choir members were allowed to walk from their respective plantations to Rowans Chapel for practice. Every Sunday morning, they gathered again for the service. The plantation owners saw this as safe because it was religious activity, and they believed religion made enslaved people more docile, more obedient, more accepting of their fate. They were catastrophically wrong. The choir rehearsals became something else entirely. The Thursday evening practices, which usually lasted 2 hours, gave the conspirators time. Time away from their plantations. Time together, from different estates, sharing information, sharing experiences, sharing rage. The chapel, that symbol of white supremacy and power, became the birthplace of the most coordinated act of resistance the region had ever seen. Cypress Hollow in 1839 was a powder keg. The plantation owners couldn't see it because they had blinded themselves with their own ideology. They looked at their enslaved workers and saw property, saw tools, saw profit margins. They never saw the human beings staring back at them, never acknowledged the intelligence, the dignity, the burning desire for freedom that no amount of violence could extinguish. They never considered that the people forced to sing, Rock of Ages, every Sunday might one day decide that the rock they needed to hide behind wasn't God, but action. Violent, coordinated, irreversible action. The economic records from Cypress Hollow show that 1838 and 1839 were banner years. Cotton prices were high. The harvest was abundant. The 7 plantations were more profitable than they had ever been. Marcus Thornfield's personal wealth had increased by 40% in just 2 years. The Ashmont family had purchased an additional 50 acres and 20 more human beings to work it. Reverend Thornton preached sermons thanking God for the prosperity, calling it evidence of divine favor. But that prosperity came at a cost the plantation owners never had to calculate. Every dollar of profit represented stolen labor, stolen lives, stolen futures. Every percentage point of increased wealth represented another layer of trauma, another family torn apart, another woman raped, another child born into bondage, another man whipped until he couldn't stand. The people who paid that cost kept a different kind of ledger, one written not in account books but in scars, in grief, in the memory of every injustice that could never be forgiven, never be forgotten. And 23 members of the Rowans Chapel choir decided that ledger was due. The bill was coming due on Sunday, August 11, 1839, and payment would be rendered in full. William Mercer wasn't supposed to be able to read. In Cypress Hollow, literacy among the enslaved was not just forbidden, it was a crime punishable by mutilation. The plantation owners understood that knowledge was power, that the written word could spark ideas more dangerous than any weapon. But William's previous enslaver, an elderly widow who had owned him before selling him to Marcus Thornfield in 1833, had been a Quaker with complicated beliefs about slavery. She believed in keeping human beings as property, but also believed those human beings had souls that deserved Christian education. So she taught young William his letters, taught him to read the Bible, taught him something far more dangerous than she ever intended, that he was capable of learning anything a white man could learn. By 1839, William was 34 years old and had been the unofficial choir director at Rowans Chapel for 6 years. He had a voice that could shake the rafters, a deep baritone that the white congregation particularly loved. Marcus Thornfield often showed him off to visiting plantation owners, bragging about the quality of his property. What Thornfield didn't know was that William spent his rare moments of privacy reading everything he could get his hands on. Discarded newspapers. Old books left behind in the big house. And most importantly, he read the Bible not as a tool of oppression but as a text of liberation. He found the stories the Reverend never preached. The story of Moses leading his people out of bondage. The story of Judith beheading Holofernes. The story of David bringing down Goliath. But it wasn't just scripture that shaped William's thinking. In 1836, he had found a 3-month-old copy of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, being used as kindling in the big house kitchen. He smuggled it back to his quarters and read it by moonlight, learning for the first time that there were white people in the North who believed slavery was wrong, who were fighting to end it. He learned about the Underground Railroad. He learned about successful slave revolts in Haiti and Jamaica. He learned that resistance was possible, that freedom wasn't just a fantasy. William had also learned the bitter lessons of loss. 3 years before, in 1836, his wife Sarah had been sold to a plantation in Louisiana to settle a gambling debt Marcus Thornfield had incurred. William had begged on his knees for Thornfield not to separate them. He had offered to work double hours, to take on any punishment, anything to keep his wife. Thornfield had laughed and told him that a slave's feelings were no more relevant than a horse's preference for its stablemate. Sarah was dragged away while William was held down by 3 overseers. He never saw her again. He never even learned if she survived the journey south. That loss crystallized something in William. The grief transformed into something harder, colder, more dangerous. He stopped praying for mercy from white men and started planning how to take justice for himself. But he was smart enough to know he couldn't do it alone. One man with rage was just a dead man waiting to happen. But a group, coordinated and careful, might actually achieve something before they were inevitably caught and killed. Sophie Whitmore was 28 years old and had the most beautiful voice anyone in Cypress Hollow had ever heard. The white families would fall silent when she sang solos, genuinely moved by the purity and power of her soprano. What they heard was music. What Sophie poured into every note was grief, rage, and a hatred so deep it had become part of her bones. She had been 14 when Jonathan Ashmont first came to her quarters in the darkness. She had been 15 when she gave birth to her first child by him, a daughter she named Mercy in a prayer that went unanswered. By the time she was 28, she had 3 children, all fathered by the man who owned her, all legally his property. The worst part wasn't the rape itself, though that was horror enough. The worst part was that Ashmont treated these violations as his right, as natural as picking fruit from a tree he owned. He never acknowledged the children as his, though they had his pale skin and sharp nose. He recorded their births in his plantation ledger right alongside the calves born to his cattle. And when Sophie's eldest daughter Grace turned 13, Ashmont had started visiting her quarters too. Sophie had tried everything to protect her daughter. She had begged the overseer's wife to intervene, knowing the white woman must have known what her husband's employer was doing. The woman had told her to stop making up wicked stories. She had tried to hide Grace, to make her appear sickly and undesirable. It hadn't worked. The night Sophie heard her daughter crying in the quarters Ashmont had moved her to, something broke inside her that would never be repaired. She stopped singing with any emotion except carefully controlled fury. And when William Mercer approached her after choir practice in February of 1839 and asked if she was tired of singing for the people who destroyed her, she had answered without hesitation, "Tell me what you need me to do." Adam Kane was 41 years old and carried the history of Cypress Hollow's cruelty on his back in the form of thick, raised scars that had never properly healed. He was the eldest of the conspirators and had survived longer than most because he had learned early to swallow his pride, to bow his head, to endure. But there were limits to what even the most bent spirit could tolerate. In 1837, he had been accused of stealing a chicken from Belcourt Plantation's henhouse. He hadn't done it. A fox had taken the bird, and several people had seen it happen. But the overseer needed someone to blame, and Adam was convenient. 200 lashes. That was the punishment for theft. They tied him to the whipping post in front of all the enslaved workers on Belcourt Plantation, forcing everyone to watch as a lesson. The overseer, a man named Pike who took genuine pleasure in his work, administered every lash himself. Adam had passed out after 90. They threw cold water on him to revive him and continued. By the time it was over, his back looked like raw meat. The plantation doctor, such as he was, had poured whiskey over the wounds and sent Adam back to his quarters with no further treatment. Infection set in within 2 days. Adam survived because an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth knew which herbs could fight infection and spent 3 weeks nursing him when she should have been sleeping. The physical scars healed, more or less. The psychological ones never did. Adam had been a gentleman before the whipping, someone who sang in the choir because he genuinely loved music, who tried to find small joys wherever he could. After the whipping, something hardened in him. He looked at the white faces in the congregation every Sunday and thought about how easy it would be to snap their necks if he could just get close enough. When William began quietly recruiting for his plan, Adam was one of the first to volunteer. He asked only one thing, that he be allowed to personally deal with the men from Belcourt Plantation. Temperance Gray was 23 years old and had buried 2 children before they reached adolescence. Her son Elijah had been 9 when he collapsed in the cotton field on a July day so hot the overseer himself had retreated to the shade. The boy had been worked to exhaustion, given minimal food and water, pushed beyond what his small body could endure. He died before sunset. The Wickham Heights plantation ledger recorded it as a loss of property valued at $300. Her daughter Patience had been 12 when she developed a fever that wouldn't break. There was no doctor for enslaved children. Patience burned up from the inside over 3 days while Temperance held her and prayed to a God she was increasingly certain wasn't listening. The plantation ledger recorded that loss at $450. Temperance had been born on Wickham Heights Plantation, as had her mother and her grandmother before her. 3 generations of women who had given their lives, their labor, their children to the Wickham family's prosperity. And for what? So that Elizabeth Wickham could wear silk dresses and complain about the heat while fanning herself with imported Spanish fans? so that her husband could smoke expensive cigars and discuss cotton prices while children died in his fields. The rage Temperance carried was cold and patient. She didn't want to just hurt the Wickhams. She wanted them erased. When William had approached her with his plan, she had listened carefully, asked intelligent questions about timing and coordination, and then offered a crucial insight: the best time to strike would be during Sunday service when most of the overseers attended a different church in the next county. The plantations would be understaffed. The families would be gathered in one place. And no one would expect trouble during worship. These four became the core of the conspiracy. William with his literacy and strategic planning. Sophie with her burning motivation and steady nerve. Adam with his willingness to do whatever violence was necessary. Temperance with her cold calculation and attention to detail. But they couldn't do this alone. They needed more people. Enough to ensure that once the violence started, it could be completed before anyone escaped to raise the alarm. The recruitment process took months and was the most dangerous part of the entire plan. Approaching the wrong person could mean betrayal, torture, and execution. But the four conspirators knew their fellow choir members. They knew who had lost children, who had been whipped until they couldn't walk, who had watched family members sold away, who carried the kind of pain that transformed into willingness to risk everything. One by one, they brought people into the plan. Samuel from Thornfield, whose sister had been raped to death by an overseer. Rebecca from Rosewood, whose husband had been beaten so severely he never recovered and died slowly over weeks. Moses from Greystone, who had been sold away from his family in Virginia as a child and still remembered his mother's screams. Each recruitment followed the same pattern. A quiet conversation after choir practice. A careful assessment of the person's trustworthiness. A simple question: are you tired of singing for them? And if the answer was yes, if the person's eyes showed that spark of desperate willingness, then came the details. Not all at once. But slowly, carefully, testing their resolve at each stage. By the time spring turned to summer, 23 people had been brought into the conspiracy. 23 people who understood they were likely signing their own death warrants, but who had decided that dying while fighting was preferable to living in continued bondage. They were teachers and field hands. They were young and old. They were men and women. They were people who had been born into slavery and people who still remembered freedom. What united them wasn't just suffering, though they had all suffered beyond measure. What united them was the understanding that the system that oppressed them would never voluntarily change, that mercy from their enslavers was a fantasy, that if they wanted justice they would have to take it themselves, regardless of the cost. And the cost, they all knew, would be everything. The conspiracy began in earnest on February 14, 1839, though none of the conspirators remarked on the bitter irony of planning mass murder on a day associated with love. William Mercer had called the first meeting in a location that seemed impossible to reach undetected, a clearing deep in the cypress swamp that bordered all 7 plantations. The swamp was considered too dangerous for casual travel, filled with cottonmouths and alligators, thick with mud that could swallow a person whole. But that same danger made it the perfect meeting place. No overseer would venture that deep. No plantation owner would imagine their property gathering there. That first meeting included only the core 4, William, Sophie, Adam, and Temperance. They met 2 hours after midnight, when even the most vigilant overseers were asleep. The journey to the swamp was treacherous in the darkness, but they had all memorized the path during daylight reconnaissance. William had brought a shuttered lantern that provided just enough light to see each other's faces. They sat on fallen logs in a rough circle, and for the first few minutes, no one spoke. The weight of what they were contemplating pressed down on them like a physical force. William broke the silence. He laid out the basic framework of what would become the Rowans Chapel massacre. The target would be a Sunday service when all the plantation families were gathered together. The method would be coordinated violence using whatever weapons they could acquire. The goal would be total elimination of the adult plantation owners and their families, leaving no one to sound the alarm or organize pursuit. Sophie had asked the question they were all thinking, and after. What happens to us after? William had been honest. There was no after. This wasn't a plan for freedom. This was a plan for justice, for revenge, for making the people who had tortured them pay a price before the inevitable end came. They would all die for this. But they would die having struck back. The other three had nodded. They had already made their peace with death. What they hadn't made peace with was dying without resistance. Over the next month, they recruited the other 19 members of the conspiracy. Each recruitment was a careful process. William would identify potential members based on their grief, their rage, their trustworthiness. Then one of the core four would approach them individually, usually during choir practice when conversations could be disguised as discussions about music. The approach was always subtle at first. "You seem troubled, brother. The weight you carry shows in your voice." If the person responded with openness, if they seemed safe, the conversation would go deeper. "Have you ever wondered what would happen if we stopped singing their songs? If we sang our own?" And if they still seemed receptive, if their eyes showed that spark of desperate willingness, then would come the direct invitation, "We're planning something. Something that will cost us everything but might mean something to those who come after. Will you listen?" Not everyone they approached agreed to join. 3 people declined, 2 afraid of the consequences or too beaten down by the system to believe resistance was possible. But remarkably, none of those 3 betrayed the conspiracy. Perhaps they understood that betrayal would only result in the torture and execution of their fellow enslaved people. Perhaps they simply wanted to see what would happen, even if they couldn't participate themselves. Or perhaps, on some level, they approved. By mid-March, the conspiracy had its full complement of 23 members. The number wasn't arbitrary. It represented every adult member of the Rowans Chapel choir except those 3 who had declined. William had calculated that 23 armed people, positioned correctly and acting in coordination, could eliminate 112 unarmed people in minutes if the element of surprise was absolute. But they needed weapons. This became the most dangerous and time-consuming part of the planning. Firearms were heavily controlled on the plantations, kept locked in the big houses or in overseer quarters. Getting access required patience and opportunity. Samuel, who worked in the Thornfield big house as a servant, was able to steal a pistol from Marcus Thornfield's study over the course of 3 weeks. He couldn't take it all at once, the absence would be noticed immediately. Instead, he smuggled out components during his rare unsupervised moments. First the barrel. Then the firing mechanism. Then the ammunition. He assembled the complete weapon in his quarters and hid it in a hollow beneath the floorboards. Rebecca, who did laundry for the Rosewood Plantation family, managed to steal 2 knives from the kitchen by replacing them with similar-looking utensils from the slave quarters. The deception worked because the white family barely paid attention to what their enslaved workers did, as long as the work got done. Moses, working in the Greystone Plantation stable, stole a small pistol from an overseer's saddlebag and replaced it with a rock wrapped in cloth that would feel approximately the same weight if the overseer checked casually. The overseer didn't notice for weeks. The weapon acquisition took 3 months. By June, the conspirators had assembled an arsenal that seemed impossible given their circumstances: 7 pistols, 2 rifles, and 14 knives. It wasn't much compared to what the white militias could bring to bear once the alarm was raised, but it would be more than enough for their purposes. The weapons were hidden in various locations. Some were buried in the swamp. Others were concealed in the slave quarters under floorboards or in false bottoms of storage chests. 3 were hidden inside the chapel itself, in the choir loft, tucked into gaps in the wall boards where no one would think to look. But acquiring weapons was only one challenge. The conspirators also had to overcome a lifetime of psychological conditioning. Every enslaved person in Cypress Hollow had been taught from birth that resistance was futile, that white people were inherently superior, that obedience was survival. Breaking through that conditioning required constant reinforcement. The Thursday evening choir practices became more than just planning sessions. They became something closer to religious revival meetings, but instead of worshiping God, they were worshipping the idea of their own agency. William would lead these sessions, speaking with the passion of a preacher. He would remind them of every indignity they had suffered, every family member lost, every scar on their backs. He would read to them from the Bible passages about liberation and justice that Reverend Thornton never mentioned. He would tell them about Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, how enslaved people had risen up and killed their oppressors. Turner's rebellion had failed, and he had been executed, but the point wasn't success. The point was that resistance was possible, that enslaved people had agency, that they could choose to fight back even if the odds were impossible. There were moments when the conspiracy almost fell apart. In early May, one of the members, a young man named Jacob from Magnolia Bend, began having second thoughts. The weight of what they were planning pressed on him until he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He came to William in private and said he wasn't sure he could go through with killing women and children. William had understood the hesitation. But he had also been firm. Those women watched their husbands rape our daughters and said nothing. Those children will grow up to be exactly like their parents. This system doesn't allow for innocence. We strike everyone, or we might as well not strike at all. Jacob had wrestled with this for another week before finally recommitting to the plan. But the incident had shaken William. If one person could waver, others might too. He realized they needed something more than rage to hold them together. They needed a sense of higher purpose, a belief that what they were doing meant something beyond revenge. So William reframed the mission. This wasn't just about killing their oppressors, though that was part of it. This was about sending a message that would echo through history. They would show every enslaved person in the South that resistance was possible. They would prove that the plantation owners weren't invincible. They would demonstrate that there were consequences for the brutality of slavery, even if those consequences came at the cost of their own lives. This would be their legacy. This would be what they left behind. The speech worked. The conspirators found renewed purpose. And the planning became more detailed, more refined. They mapped out exactly where each person would stand in the choir loft. They calculated the sight lines, determined who would have the clearest shots at which members of the congregation. They practiced the movements in the swamp, using stones to represent the pews, acting out the moment when they would reveal their weapons and descend on the congregation. They drilled until every movement was muscle memory, until they could execute the plan in their sleep. Temperance made another crucial contribution to the planning. She pointed out that the chapel doors needed to be secured from the inside to prevent anyone from escaping. They couldn't afford to have even one person run out and alert the overseers who remained on the plantations. Moses, who had carpentry skills, fashioned 2 wooden bars that could be quickly placed across the double doors. They would be hidden in the choir loft, brought down at the last moment before the violence began. As August approached, the rehearsals intensified. They met in the swamp 3 times a week now, risking more frequent trips because they needed to be absolutely certain everyone knew their role. William assigned specific targets to specific people. Sophie would handle the Ashmont family. Adam would take the Belcourt pew. Temperance would eliminate the Wickhams. Samuel would handle Marcus Thornfield himself. The assignments weren't random. Each person was matched with the family that had caused them the most direct pain. There was one final element that needed to be addressed, the aftermath. They all knew they would be caught. There was no escape plan because escape wasn't realistic. But they wanted to make it as far as possible before being captured, to buy time, to create chaos, to make the white establishment work for their revenge. William had studied maps of the region that he had seen in Thornfield's study. He knew there was a route north that might get them 40 or 50 miles before the militias caught up. It wouldn't be enough to reach free territory, but it would be something. It would mean they had tried. The night before the planned massacre, the 23 conspirators met one final time in the swamp. No one slept. They spent the hours before dawn sitting together, some praying, some silent, all preparing themselves mentally for what Sunday morning would bring. William led them in a hymn, not one of the songs they sang for the white congregation, but an old spiritual that had been passed down through generations. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. They sang it quietly, their voices barely above a whisper, the words taking on new meaning. They were about to wade into waters that would indeed be troubled. Waters are red with blood. Waters that would drown them all eventually. But waters that would wash away, at least for a moment, the stain of their oppression. When dawn broke on August 11, 1839, the 23 conspirators returned to their respective plantations. They went through the motions of their morning routines. They ate their meager breakfast. They endured the casual cruelties of the overseers. And then, as they had every Sunday for years, they put on their choir robes and made their way to Rowans Chapel. The weapons were waiting. The plan was set. The moment had arrived. The morning of August 11, 1839, began like every other Sunday in Cypress Hollow. The sun rose over the Mississippi Delta, burning off the morning mist that clung to the cotton fields. In the big houses of 7 plantations, white families dressed in their finest clothes. Children had their hair brushed and faces scrubbed. Men adjusted their cravats in mirrors. Women pinned their bonnets and smoothed their silk skirts. In the slave quarters, 23 people prepared themselves for death. William Mercer had barely slept. He had spent the night going over every detail of the plan, searching for flaws, for anything they had overlooked. But the planning was done. Now came the execution, in every sense of that word. He dressed in his choir robe carefully, running his hands over the fabric, feeling the weight of the pistol concealed beneath. The weapon pressed against his ribs with each breath, a constant reminder of what was coming. He thought about Sarah, his wife, sold away 3 years ago. He wondered if she was still alive somewhere in Louisiana. He hoped she would somehow hear about what happened today, that she would know he had finally stopped bowing his head. At Ashmont Plantation, Sophie Whitmore kissed her 3 children goodbye. They were too young to understand why their mother held them longer than usual, why her eyes were wet when she finally released them. Her eldest daughter Grace, now 14, looked at her with questioning eyes. Sophie wanted to tell her that after today, Jonathan Ashmont would never touch her again, would never touch anyone again. But she couldn't risk even that small confession. So she simply whispered, "Remember that your mama loved you more than breathing," and walked out the door toward the chapel. The families began arriving at Rowans Chapel around 9:30 in the morning. The Thornfields came first, as always, Marcus leading his wife Catherine and their 3 children up the steps. He nodded to the enslaved people who held the doors open, not seeing them as human beings but as fixtures of the building itself. The Ashmonts arrived moments later in a fine carriage, Jonathan helping his wife Elizabeth down with exaggerated courtesy. The Belcourts, the Wickhams, the Rosewood family, the Greystones, the Magnolia Bend owners, they all filed in over the next 15 minutes, greeting each other warmly, discussing the weather and cotton prices and the latest gossip from New Orleans. By 10 o'clock, the entire congregation had settled into their pews. 112 people, ranging in age from a 3-month-old baby in her mother's arms to 78-year-old Cornelius Wickham, the patriarch who had founded Wickham Heights 50 years earlier. They were dressed in their Sunday finest, comfortable in their power, secure in their supremacy. The children fidgeted. The adults settled in with satisfied expressions. This was their kingdom, and Sunday service was the weekly celebration of their dominion. The choir filed into the loft at the back of the sanctuary at precisely 10:15, as they had every Sunday. 23 people in dark robes, their faces composed, their movements practiced. No one in the congregation noticed anything unusual. Why would they? These were just slaves, property trained to sing on command. William took his position at the center front, facing the congregation. From this elevated position, he could see every face below. Sophie stood to his right. Adam to his left. Temperance in the second row, directly behind him. The others arranged precisely as they had practiced dozens of times. Reverend Obadiah Thornton stood at the pulpit and welcomed the congregation. His voice boomed through the chapel, rich with self-satisfaction. He led them in an opening prayer, thanking God for the prosperity he had bestowed upon Cypress Hollow, for the abundant harvest, for the natural order that placed some men above others. The congregation murmured their amens. In the choir loft, 23 people remained silent, their hatred a palpable force. The service proceeded through its familiar rhythms. A reading from Ephesians about servants obeying their masters. A hymn. Another reading from Colossians repeating the same message. Another hymn. Reverend Thornton launched into his sermon, a familiar lecture about gratitude and obedience and accepting one's station in life. He gestured enthusiastically as he spoke, completely absorbed in his own rhetoric, never noticing the 2 wooden bars that had been quietly positioned near the chapel's main doors during the first hymn. Marcus Thornfield dozed slightly during the sermon, his head bobbing forward before jerking back up. His son, 16-year-old Marcus Jr., elbowed him awake. Several women fanned themselves against the August heat. A child began crying and was quickly shushed by her mother. These were the mundane details of a Sunday service, repeated every week for 17 years in this building. Comfortable. Routine. Safe. At 11:20, Reverend Thornton concluded his sermon and announced the final hymn. Rock of Ages, he said. Page 47 in your hymnals. The congregation stood, rustling with the sound of turning pages and shifting fabric. In the choir loft, William raised his hands to conduct. The piano began the introduction. And 23 voices lifted in perfect harmony. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. The words floated through the chapel, beautiful and mournful. Some in the congregation sang along. Others simply listened, their eyes closed in reverence. The choir's voices blended seamlessly, the product of years of practice. William conducted with smooth, practiced movements, his face serene. But his heart hammered in his chest like a war drum. The hymn progressed through its verses. Let the water and the blood, from thy wounded side which flowed, be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. The irony of the words wasn't lost on the conspirators. They were about to create a river of blood, and there would be no salvation from the wrath they were about to unleash. As they sang the final verse, Moses and Samuel quietly descended from the choir loft, moving along the side walls where they wouldn't be easily visible. They moved with purpose toward the main doors. The congregation was entirely focused on the music, on the reverend who stood with his hands raised in benediction. No one noticed the 2 men lifting the wooden bars into place, securing the doors from the inside, sealing everyone in the chapel. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. The final words hung in the air, the last note sustained and pure. The congregation remained standing, heads bowed, waiting for the reverend's benediction. The moment stretched, peaceful and holy. William's conducting hand froze in midair. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered it and reached beneath his robe. The movement was the signal. As one, 23 people reached for their weapons. The sound of metal clearing fabric, of hammers being cocked, of knives sliding free, these sounds finally penetrated the congregation's awareness. Heads began to turn. Eyes widened in confusion. Marcus Thornfield looked up at the choir loft and saw William Mercer pointing a pistol directly at him. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Property didn't hold weapons. Slaves didn't threaten masters. This wasn't how the world worked. William fired. The gunshot in the enclosed space was deafening. Marcus Thornfield's chest exploded in red, his expensive white shirt suddenly soaked through. He staggered backward, hit the pew behind him, and collapsed. His wife Catherine screamed and turned toward the choir loft just as Sophie Whitmore fired. The bullet caught Catherine in the throat, cutting off her scream mid-note. And then the chapel erupted in chaos. The congregation panicked, scrambling over pews, pushing children down for protection, running for the doors. But the doors were barred. People slammed against them uselessly, their screams of terror echoing off the walls. The choir descended from the loft, weapons raised, moving with terrifying calm through the aisles. Sophie Whitmore walked directly to the Ashmont pew. Jonathan Ashmont had his hands raised, his face contorted in confusion and fear. "Sophie," he said, as if her name was a question, as if he couldn't comprehend why his property was pointing a pistol at his head. She didn't answer. She fired once, twice, 3 times. Jonathan fell. His wife Elizabeth lunged at Sophie, fingernails extended like claws. Sophie sidestepped and drove her knife into Elizabeth's chest, twisted, and withdrew it. The woman collapsed across her husband's body. Adam Kane had made his way to the Belcourt family pew. Richard Belcourt, the man who had ordered 200 lashes for a crime Adam hadn't committed, tried to climb over the pew to escape. Adam grabbed him by his fine coat and slammed him back down. "Remember me?" Adam said quietly. Richard's eyes widened in recognition. "Please," he started to say. Adam shot him in the face. Temperance Gray found Elizabeth Wickham, the woman who had owned her children, worked them to death in cotton fields while complaining about the heat. Elizabeth was curled under a pew, her expensive dress hiked up around her knees, her bonnet askew. She looked up at Temperance with tears streaming down her face. "Please, I have children," she begged. "So did I," Temperance replied, and brought the knife down. The massacre was methodical, efficient, brutal. The conspirators moved through the chapel with grim determination, executing the plan they had rehearsed dozens of times. Some of the plantation owners tried to fight back. Young Marcus Thornfield grabbed a hymnal and threw it at Samuel, then charged at him with his fists raised. Samuel shot him in the chest. Cornelius Wickham, despite being 78 years old, pulled a small pocket knife and managed to cut William's arm before Adam shot him from behind. But these were isolated acts of desperation. The plantation owners had never imagined they would need to defend themselves from their own property. They had no weapons, no plan, no coordination. They were sheep in a pen, and the shepherds had become wolves. The children's screams were constant, high-pitched wails of terror that filled every corner of the chapel. Some of the conspirators hesitated when faced with killing children. But William had been clear in the planning: everyone had to die. There could be no witnesses, no one left to identify them, no one to sound the alarm. The children would grow up to be their parents. The system perpetuated itself through generations. This had to be total. Rebecca from Rosewood stood over a 10-year-old boy who was crying hysterically, frozen in place with fear. She raised her pistol, her hand shaking. The boy looked up at her with his parents' eyes, with the same entitled expectation that slaves existed to serve him. Rebecca thought of her husband, beaten to death for looking at a white woman the wrong way. She pulled the trigger. The massacre lasted 12 minutes from first shot to final death. 12 minutes of coordinated violence that transformed Rowans Chapel from a place of worship into a charnel house. The white walls were splattered with blood. Bodies lay sprawled across pews, slumped in aisles, piled near the barred doors where people had desperately tried to escape. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the copper scent of blood and the acrid stench of bowels released in death. When it was over, when the last scream had faded and the last body had fallen, the 23 conspirators stood among the carnage they had created. Some were splattered with blood. Some were crying. Some stood in shocked silence, processing what they had just done. William's ears rang from the gunshots. His arm bled where Cornelius Wickham had cut him. But he felt something he hadn't felt in years: powerful. They had done it. 112 of Cypress Hollow's white elite lay dead. The entire ruling class of 7 plantations, wiped out in less than 15 minutes. Before we continue with what happened next, I need you to understand something. What you just heard was an act of desperate resistance by people who had exhausted every other option. This wasn't senseless violence. This was the inevitable result of a system built on violence, responding in the only language that system understood. If this story is affecting you, if you're struggling with the brutality of it, good. You should be. But direct that discomfort toward understanding the system that created this moment, not just the moment itself. Hit that subscribe button because this channel exists to tell these stories that make us uncomfortable, that force us to confront the realities of our history. And comment below, do you believe violent resistance against slavery was justified? I want real discussion, not easy answers. Now, let's talk about what happened to the 23 people who just changed history. The 23 conspirators stood in the blood-soaked chapel for perhaps 5 minutes after the last shot was fired, the magnitude of what they had done settling over them like a shroud. The silence was profound after the chaos, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the sound of their own ragged breathing. William Mercer was the first to move. He walked to the pulpit where Reverend Obadiah Thornton lay slumped, a bullet hole in his chest, his mouth still open in the benediction he never finished delivering. William placed his hand on the Bible that lay on the pulpit, the same Bible that had been used to justify their bondage for 17 years, and he spoke words that would be recorded by the sole survivor who lived long enough to give testimony before dying of his wounds. Let it be known that we did this not as animals, but as human beings. Not as property, but as people. May God judge us as he sees fit, but know that we have already been judged by man and found wanting only because we refused to accept our chains. Then came the practical matters. They couldn't stay in the chapel. Every minute they delayed increased the chances that someone from one of the plantations would come looking for their employers. The Sunday service typically ended around noon, and families usually lingered for another hour of socializing. That gave them perhaps 90 minutes before suspicion would arise, maybe 2 hours before alarm would truly spread. They needed to move. The conspirators stripped the bodies of anything useful. Money from wallets and purses. Jewelry that could be traded. Food that some families had brought for the post-service social hour. They took weapons from the men who carried them, finding 3 more pistols and 2 knives. They gathered supplies with efficient brutality, stepping over the bodies of people who had owned them just hours before. Sophie Whitmore paused at Jonathan Ashmont's corpse, looked down at the man who had raped her for 14 years, and spat on his face before moving on. They left through the chapel doors at 11:45, stepping out into brilliant August sunshine that seemed obscene after what had just transpired inside. 23 people, some covered in blood, carrying weapons and stolen supplies, standing in front of a building that now contained more dead bodies than any single location in Mississippi history. They moved quickly toward the horses that were tied up outside, the fine animals that had carried the plantation families to their final Sunday service. William had mapped out their escape route during the months of planning. They would head north, staying off main roads, using the cover of forests and swamps. The goal was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Cypress Hollow before the bodies were discovered. They knew they wouldn't make it to free territory. The distance was too great, over 1,000 miles to cross into free states, and they would be pursued by every white man in Mississippi once word spread. But they could run. They could make them work for it. The group moved as one, 23 riders on stolen horses, carrying stolen weapons, having committed the most audacious act of resistance the South had seen since Nat Turner's rebellion 8 years earlier. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, putting 30 miles between themselves and the chapel before the horses began to tire. They stopped at a creek to water the animals and assess their situation. It was Temperance who spoke what they were all thinking. They'll kill us slow when they catch us. You all know that. Everyone nodded. The reprisals for slave rebellions were always brutal, designed not just to punish but to terrorize, to send a message to every enslaved person in the region that resistance meant suffering beyond imagination. Then we make sure we take as many of them with us as we can before it ends, Adam replied, checking the ammunition in his pistol. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, covering another 20 miles before darkness forced them to stop. They made camp in a dense forest, posting sentries, knowing that by now the bodies had been discovered and the hunt had begun. None of them slept much. They sat around a small fire, speaking quietly about what they had done, about the families they had left behind, about the inevitable end that was coming. William used this time to ensure their story would be remembered. He had brought paper and a pencil stolen from Marcus Thornfield's study months earlier, and he wrote by firelight. He wrote down the names of all 23 conspirators. He wrote down what had been done to them, the specific cruelties that had driven them to this point. He wrote down what they had done in the chapel and why. He sealed this document in a tin container and buried it at the base of a distinctive split oak tree, marking the location carefully. His hope was that someday, perhaps decades or centuries later, someone would find it and know the truth. The second day of flight covered less ground. The horses were exhausted, and the conspirators themselves were wearing down. They had been running on adrenaline and rage, but both were finite resources. On the evening of August 12, 47 miles north of Cypress Hollow, they spotted the dust cloud on the horizon behind them. The militia had caught up. The historical records show that over 200 men joined the hunt for the Rowans Chapel conspirators. Plantation owners from surrounding counties, overseers, professional slave catchers, and militia members organized by the governor of Mississippi himself. They brought dogs, weapons, and a burning desire for revenge. The news of what had happened in Cypress Hollow had spread like wildfire, and white communities throughout the region were terrified that this rebellion might inspire others. The final confrontation happened in a clearing near the town of Greenwood, Mississippi. The 23 conspirators were surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, exhausted and running low on ammunition. William called for everyone to gather close. They formed a circle, weapons pointed outward, and he spoke one final time as their leader. "We die free," he said simply. "We die having struck back. We die as human beings, not as property. Let them remember that." The militia commander called for them to surrender, promising a fair trial. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. William's response was to fire a shot in the air. "Come and take us," he shouted back. The battle lasted less than an hour. The conspirators fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmingly outgunned. One by one they fell. Adam Kane took 3 bullets before he went down, still trying to reload his pistol. Temperance Gray killed 2 militia members before she was shot through the heart. Sophie Whitmore sang as she fought, her beautiful voice carrying over the sound of gunfire until a bullet silenced it forever. William was the last one standing, wounded in the leg and shoulder, bleeding from a dozen cuts, but still upright. He had watched all 22 of his co-conspirators die. The militia surrounded him, weapons trained on his chest. "Surrender," the commander ordered one final time. William smiled, blood on his teeth, and raised his empty pistol. "Rock of Ages," he sang, his voice cracking but clear, "cleft for me." The militia fired. William Mercer, 34 years old, died on his feet. But the story doesn't end with their deaths. The state of Mississippi wanted to make an example that would echo through history. The bodies of the 23 conspirators were taken to different counties throughout Mississippi. Public executions were staged in each location, the bodies hung from gallows even though they were already dead, sometimes for days at a time. The corpses were displayed as warnings, left to rot in the sun as terror propaganda. The message was clear: this is what happens to slaves who resist. Cypress Hollow never recovered. 7 plantations had lost their entire ownership class in a single morning. Distant relatives came to claim the estates, but many chose to sell rather than move to the county where such horror had occurred. The enslaved populations of those plantations were sold off, scattered to other locations, families torn apart once again in the aftermath. Within 5 years, Cypress Hollow's population had dropped by 60%. The Cotton Empire crumbled. Rowans Chapel was burned to the ground by surviving relatives of the massacre victims. They couldn't bear for the building to stand, couldn't stomach the idea of ever setting foot in that blood-soaked sanctuary again. The site remained empty for decades, eventually becoming overgrown with vegetation, reclaimed by the swamp. Today, there's a historical marker there, though it took until 1998 for the state to acknowledge what happened with anything approaching honesty. The immediate aftermath for the enslaved populations across the South was brutal. In response to the Rowans Chapel slayings, Mississippi and neighboring states passed even harsher slave codes. Enslaved people were forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 3 without white supervision. The penalties for teaching slaves to read were increased. Patrols were intensified. The system tightened its grip, terrified that what happened in Cypress Hollow might spark wider rebellion. But the story didn't stay buried forever. Abolitionists in the North seized on the Rowans Chapel slayings as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and instability. Frederick Douglass wrote about it in his newspaper, framing it not as a massacre but as a justifiable uprising against tyranny. The event became part of the growing body of evidence that slavery couldn't be maintained peacefully, that violence was woven into its very fabric, that enslaved people would always resist, regardless of the cost. In the century that followed, the story was deliberately suppressed in Southern historical accounts. Textbooks either didn't mention it at all or framed it as an act of savage violence by ungrateful slaves against benevolent masters. The truth, that 23 desperate people fought back against systematic brutality, was too dangerous to acknowledge. It undermined the mythology that slavery had been a benign institution, that enslaved people had been content with their lot. The full story of the Rowans Chapel slayings wasn't properly documented until the 1960s, when civil rights-era historians began excavating suppressed narratives of black resistance. In 1973, a graduate student named Marcus Johnson found William Mercer's buried testimony in the forest near Greenwood. The tin container had preserved the document remarkably well. William's words, written by firelight on the last night of his freedom, finally reached the public 134 years after his death. Today, the Rowans Chapel slayings stand as one of the most significant acts of organized resistance during the slavery era. It wasn't the largest. Nat Turner's rebellion killed more people. It wasn't the most successful. The Haitian Revolution actually achieved independence. But it was one of the most coordinated, most deliberately planned, most psychologically sophisticated acts of resistance in American slavery history. 23 people, with no military training, with limited resources, with everything to lose, executed a plan that temporarily shattered the power structure of an entire county. The question that haunts us today is why this story isn't taught in schools. Why most Americans have never heard of the Rowans Chapel slayings. Why it took until the late 20th century for historians to even acknowledge it honestly. The answer is uncomfortable but necessary. We don't teach it because it forces us to confront the reality that enslaved people weren't passive victims. They were active resistors who fought back whenever possible, who chose violence when violence was the only language their oppressors understood, who refused to accept their dehumanization even when resistance meant certain death. William Mercer, Sophie Whitmore, Adam Kane, Temperance Gray, and the 19 others whose names deserve to be remembered chose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. They didn't achieve freedom. They didn't inspire immediate widespread rebellion. But they proved something that the slaveholding South desperately wanted to deny, that enslaved people were human beings capable of agency, strategy, courage, and resistance. Their story matters. Their names matter. Their choice to fight back, despite knowing the inevitable outcome, matters. Because resistance always matters, even when it fails. Especially when it fails. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but crucial story. This is the history they don't want you to know, the narratives that get buried because they're too uncomfortable, too challenging to the myths we tell ourselves about our past. If you believe stories like the Rowans Chapel slayings should be taught in schools, if you think we need to confront the full truth of slavery including the resistance it provoked, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists to bring you these suppressed histories, these macabre truths that textbooks ignore. Drop a comment below and let's have a real conversation. Should violent resistance against slavery be celebrated or condemned? How do we ethically assess acts like this? And why do you think this story has been deliberately buried for so long? I want to hear your thoughtful perspectives, your questions, your reactions. I've got more stories like this coming, hidden histories of resistance, rebellion, and the people who refuse to accept oppression quietly. Stories that will challenge everything you thought you knew about American history. You won't want to miss them. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one where we dig into another chapter of history that somebody wanted forgotten.